So over the course of the last couple of weeks, we've had several questions about the issue of firearms and changes in firearm legislation. We have a viewer from Orr who has called in with a question, called in last week. We didn't have a chance to get to it, but we can raise it here, talking about the rural and urban divide with regard to gun issues and related topics. You know, rather than cross-examining the panel about specific bills, I think maybe I'd prefer to give you an opportunity to tell me about how you see that issue unfolding in this session, and then we can maybe drill down to some specifics after that. And let's start with you, Representative. What are you hearing? What do you think on some of these issues relating to firearms and guns?
Well, I haven't been involved with the legislation itself, so I'm glad that you prefaced it more on the generalities. From the area I'm from, of course, the Second Amendment is a pretty strong issue, and I've always been there myself. I mean, I've looked at constitutional amendments, and I don't always necessarily agree with the way people are carrying them out. We have some issues with the First Amendment as well, where I grew up during the Vietnam coming home, and I remember some of the harm that was done with First Amendment because, you know, people came home after doing their job from military service and were criticized and are still suffering today. I know people that are still suffering today. So I think any amendment, any right, you can have difficulties with it, especially enforcing it as it was made. So I have some real reservations about clamping on too much more. I feel that we have a lot of laws now, and the laws that we have need to be enforced rigorously, too. So from a philosophical standpoint, I haven't looked at many bills. I don't know what's been introduced. But my right now, I'd be inclined to say, let's look at the reason that people are pulling that trigger. We always had guns in our house because my dad hunted, I hunted. Never had a problem with it. Used to go to high school. Kids could come with guns in their truck because they're going out hunting after school. We never had a problem with it. So I think we have to explore all the things that are going on around guns.
Representative Nelson?
Well, and I think in this case, Representative Vogel and I probably agree a lot on this. I'm a hunter. I own guns. But the issue breaks down differently if you're living in the city, if you're living in Minneapolis or St. Paul, and you hear gunshots in the morning. That's a bad thing. But when you're out in the country or you're out in northern Minnesota and you hear gunshots in the morning, you think, somebody got lucky. And so there's a big difference in how people look at it. And that's part of the problem of the divide between the rural and the metro is that this idea that, okay, it's all one way, and it's not. And the gun safety issue, I think, in our schools and in our communities is an important issue. I live in a suburb, and we have some issues with that, and of gun violence, but they're really not a lot. And I think a lot of that could be solved with gun safety training. I think Iowa, they're starting to put gun safety training back in the schools so that everybody gets trained in the fact that these are not toys. These are dangerous objects, and you need to treat them with respect. And we need to enforce some of the laws about straw buyers. I mean, that's one of the issues that they say. They're talking about how to get the guns out of the criminals. Well, they're not buying them from the gun stores. They're not buying them from the legitimate people on the street. They're buying them out of the trunk of somebody's car. And somebody's buying these and then turning around and selling them and not doing the proper background checks on them. So that's an issue I think we need to get at more of. And I think that'll go a long way to fixing some of these issues.
Senator Pepys.
Well, it's interesting that we're Minnesotans. And although I'm a city girl, my family's from the Iron Range. And hunting was a part of the family tradition as well. So that's been carried, not for the girls so much, but for the boys. It's been carried on by my brother, who lives in Orlando, Florida. But he comes up to Minnesota every fall and goes hunting with his old high school buddies. And then he has to go back to Florida. So guess who gets the venison? My sister and I. So I always have a freezer full of venison. So, I think it means that I respect the hunting culture. I'm not going to be a hypocrite about it. But as Representative Nelson said, as Mike said, it's really kind of a different feeling in the urban area. that we do, there's a lot of fear around guns and people who have guns, and a lot of concern that, that we're not paying enough attention to gun safety, that we're letting things go through, slip through the cracks, like the red flag bill. We're not talking about legislation, but people are concerned that someone who has, you know, history of domestic violence or has some mental illness and has access to guns, or that guns aren't being locked up, or maybe we need to have a trigger lock so that young people who maybe have suicidal tendencies can't get a hold of dad or mom's gun. And so this is all what I talk about as gun safety. It's not confiscating people's guns. It's not preventing them from participating in a hunting culture where, you know, they're trained and they're safe and they wear the, what are they, the yellow vest? Red vest?
Orange.
Color?
Orange.
Vest, thank you. I'm
Orange.
sorry, orange
Or
vest.
pink.
I
Or
should know
pink.
that.
Or pink, yes. Yes.
Pink vest. But it is very different in the city.
You know, you, two of you have raised a piece of this which I think requires some more discussion, in part because it sort of underlies a lot of the misuse of firearms, and it's also a broader question, which is this question of mental illness and how do you deal with that, and you know, getting mental services to the mentally ill. So let's jump off there, Senator Pappas. Let's
Yeah.
start there and talk about that for a minute. And is that an area that's likely to see some action this session?
It certainly needs to see action because we don't have enough facilities to treat people who are mentally ill, especially when people have a crisis, that we're using hospital beds that are inappropriate for people with a mental illness. To his credit, Senator Senjum, who's the Republican chair of the bonding committee in the last bonding bill, really put some significant dollars into trying to build some facilities where mentally ill people could go to get treatment and not be sent to hospitals. And then, of course, we need the trained staff also to work with people. And we need, and young people too, who have mental illness issues. We need counselors in the schools and psychologists in the schools, and we don't often have the money to do that. You know, I think we have the second lowest, if not the lowest, percentage of counselors to students in the country. And I actually know how that happened, but that's another story. So yes, it does need to be paid attention to, but I don't know, you know, how much progress we're going to make.
Representative Vogel?
You know, I'm just surprised at how pervasive it is nowadays. I think of growing up myself, and yes, there was people that had emotional problems, but it seems so pervasive over society today, and catching kids at the right age, because it must be so difficult to go to school now and have somebody after you on Facebook or whatever else that are ganging up on you and that
Bullying.
type of stuff. It's just such a different society, and so we're ending up treating a lot of people that were maybe induced into it, whereas maybe when I was growing up, it was more of a, you know, unfortunately, some people, you know, it's an illness, and I think we don't realize that all the time, but it's an illness. But I think sometimes if you have a little bit of it, it's enhanced by all of the social pressure and all of the pressure that's being put on young people. So yes, we have to have facilities, but it sure would be nice to be able to figure out some way to get to young people and make them feel more comfortable in themselves before it gets to that problem. I don't have an answer, but it's different the way I grew up and the way I see things happening now, and how sorry I feel for kids.
And and some of that, like I said, as sort of Senator Pappas said, some of it, we don't have enough counselors in the schools. There used to be more counselors when I was going to school, and I believe probably when you were going to school, that could talk to people, that people could talk to. Also, these funny little things we have on our pockets, smartphones, that the bullying that goes on those, we didn't have that when I was in school. I mean, you could kind of get away from it.
Bullying.
There was bullying, but there wasn't that where it's always in your pocket and someone's on your phone bullying you every second of the day. We didn't have that, so I mean, some of that maybe took some of the pressure off back then, but I think it's always been an issue. There's always been people that have had issues with depression and suicide. I know when I was right out of high school, I was managing a fast food restaurant, and one of my employees, that good kid, a little quiet, but always seemed to be happy, and he stopped in Saturday night, and he was supposed to be there Sunday morning to work. Didn't show up Sunday morning. And we found out that when his parents went to church that morning, he hung himself. And no one knew that he was depressed. So it's not something that's new, it's just that it seems more pervasive. And I think some of the issues with bullying on cyberbullying has compounded some of the problems that people have.
You know, there was an interesting interview with a representative from Pennsylvania talking about this topic in federal legislation, and his point was that one of the issues is triaging in terms of dollars going to the most serious problems, the most seriously mentally ill. You talk about Senator Senjum focusing on facilities where you really do need to have people get stabilized, and then the competition from individuals who perhaps need some counseling, but it's less serious, and prioritizing the use of those dollars in where you need them the most. And of course, that's a very difficult task and a large part of what your job is. So no solution to the problem, but stay tuned. We'll probably have more opportunities to discuss it.